I had always been careful. I always checked the locks, closed the gates, kept the children closer than their own shadows. In 22 years as a nanny, I had never had a single incident, not a scratch, not a missed call. But that day, I looked away for just 1 second. Just one. And then came the scream, the screech of brakes, and silence. And that silence was enough to turn me into a monster. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Molly Wilson. I was 49 years old, and I had spent more than 2 decades as a full-time nanny. Not a babysitter, not a helper. No, a nanny in the deepest sense. It was my vocation, my calling, my entire rhythm of life. While other women my age talked about their own children leaving for college or planning family vacations, I talked about nap schedules, sensory games, toddler nutrition, and pediatric CPR certifications. I had no children of my own, but 37 little faces had passed through my care, and each of them left an imprint on my heart like a pressed flower in a book that no one else opened but me. I lived in a small 2-bedroom cottage on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Amherst, Massachusetts. It had a blue door that always stuck in the winter, white curtains I sewed myself, and a front porch littered with chalk drawings and bubble residue. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, wet wipes, and lavender spray, a scent I'd carefully curated over the years because children, even babies, remember comfort in smells. My fridge was covered in handmade cards, crayon drawings, and sun-faded construction paper hearts signed with blocky letters. Miss Molly, I love you. I woke early every morning, even on weekends, as if some internal alarm had become fused to my body after so many years. My days began with oatmeal, strong coffee, and reviewing the week's meal plans and activities for whichever child was currently in my care. I packed Band-Aids and mini puzzles like other women packed lipstick. My shoes were chosen for kneeling and running and dancing. My hands always smelled faintly of hand sanitizer. The family I worked for at the time, the Millers, had moved to town just 3 months earlier. Sarah and James, both corporate attorneys commuting into Boston, had one child, Jenna, age 3. Jenna had chestnut hair that curled at the ends like ribbon and an obsession with yellow. Yellow hairbands, yellow socks, yellow plastic animals. Her favorite book was one about a sunflower who didn't want to bloom, and she'd demand I read it 3 times before nap. She had a soft spot for shadows and a fear of balloons. Our days together were gentle and full of repetition. Children loved repetition. Morning stories, late morning snack, a walk to the neighborhood park, then lunch, followed by her sacred nap. Jenna was quiet but curious, clumsy in the way toddlers are when their limbs are still learning to cooperate. She spoke in half sentences and tiptoed more than she walked, her small feet pattering across hardwood floors like whispered raindrops. That morning had been unremarkable in the most comforting way. The kind of day where everything falls into its proper place without effort. The sun filtered gently through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the living room carpet. I had packed Jenna's lunch while she sat on the kitchen floor feeding a plastic carrot to a stuffed rabbit. The park was only 4 blocks away, a 10-minute walk if we went slow, which we always did. Jenna liked to stop and touch every crack in the sidewalk with her toe. When we reached the park, I set down our blanket in the same patch of shade we always chose, just beneath the tall maple near the edge of the play area. The air was warm but not yet heavy. the sky dotted with clouds that moved lazily. I unpacked apple slices, goldfish crackers, and a spill-proof cup of apple juice. Jenna, barefoot as usual, twirled in the grass while I laid everything out. There was something sacred about watching a child play when they believed no one was looking. Her tiny footsteps made the gentlest sound against the grass. Soft taps, pauses, then another tap as she chased an invisible butterfly or examined a dandelion gone to seed. I leaned back on my elbows and listened, as I always did, to that quiet music. The tap of tiny feet, the murmur of leaves, the occasional squeak of a swing in the distance. She wandered just far enough for me to call out, and then came running back with a crooked smile and a handful of crushed clover. She climbed into my lap without a word, pressing the green mess against my palm as if it were treasure. I kissed the top of her head and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. This was what I lived for. These moments, the small invisible ones that don't make photo albums but stay lodged in the soul. We read her book, The Sunflower That Didn't Want to Bloom, and she giggled in all the right places, correcting me when I skipped a word. Then she grew quiet, laying her head against my chest, thumb in mouth, eyes blinking slow. I thought, not for the first time, that if life had been different, she could have been mine. If I had made other choices, taken other roads, maybe I would have had a little girl just like Jenna. But instead, I had borrowed children, held them for a time, like borrowed books, loved them fiercely, returned them carefully, and that had always been enough. As we sat there, my phone buzzed somewhere in the bag beside me. I didn't move to get it. I let it ring. That was part of my boundary. I never interrupted time with the children for a screen. After it stopped, I reached into the bag to check the missed call. It was Sarah, Jenna's mom. I considered calling her back but didn't. I would wait until we got home. Jenna stirred in my lap, murmured something about the rabbit needing a blanket, then wriggled free to fetch a leaf. I watched her go, her soft steps skipping lightly over the grass, her yellow socks peeking out beneath rolled leggings. I leaned forward to gather the empty snack containers, to fold the blanket. I turned my head away, just for a moment, and in that moment, I didn't hear the tap of her tiny feet. There was no sound at all, only the sudden awareness that the silence was wrong, not calm, but absent. The air, only seconds before filled with the rhythm of her movement, had gone hollow. I looked up, and she wasn't there, not behind the maple, not on the swing, not beneath the slide. The world had shifted, and I, still on my knees, still holding a folded blanket in my hands, felt something ancient curl up inside me, something that had no words, only weight. It began with a single breath, and then the panic arrived. The moment I realized she was gone, the air inside my lungs turned heavy and sharp. My knees were still pressed into the grass where we had been sitting, but my body felt as if it were already moving, already falling forward. The blanket slipped from my hands. The snack containers toppled and rolled into the dirt. The sound of the park, the chatter of other children, the creak of the swings, the distant bark of a dog, blurred into a single humming noise behind my ears. I stood and turned, my eyes scanning for the familiar flash of yellow socks, the little curl of hair bouncing as she ran. Nothing, only grass and playground equipment and a space where she should have been. I called her name once. My throat cracked. I called again. The sound came out thin, as though my voice itself were afraid to break the silence. My feet were already moving, cutting across the patch of clover, stumbling over the uneven earth. Each step was a fragment of prayer and panic, The two tangled into one. I looked under the slide, behind the tree, toward the benches where other parents sat talking, their faces turning toward me but not moving. There was a strange lightness in my hands, as though they had lost their purpose. They reached for nothing, opened and closed in the air. I called her name a third time and heard the echo bounce off the metal fence at the park's edge. That was when the sound cut through. Brakes screeching, sharp and unnatural, like metal tearing itself apart. Then a sound like a muffled thud. Then stillness. My body moved before my mind did. I ran toward the street beyond the fence, my legs hitting the ground with a force I did not recognize. The playground blurred behind me into shapes and color. My heart pounded in my ears like a drum calling me to war. The gate was open. It had always been closed before. I didn't remember opening it. The sidewalk led to the curb, and the curb led to the road. The mist from the morning had burned off, leaving the asphalt a dull black, streaked with thin white cracks like veins. Halfway into the street stood a car, stopped at an angle, its hood tilted downward, steam rising faintly from under it. A young man stood by the driver's door, his face the color of paper, his mouth opening and closing with no sound. And there, a few feet from the car, lay Jenna, small, curled into herself, arms folded like a bird tucking its wings. Her hair spilled across the pavement, her yellow socks dull against the dark road. One of her shoes had come off and rested near the curb, bright as a canary feather, the kind of yellow that demanded to be seen even when everything else faded. The other shoe was farther away, near the edge of the crosswalk, turned upside down. I stopped at the edge of the road. My legs refused to go farther. My hands rose halfway, trembling, then fell again. The world around me slowed to a crawl. The driver took a step forward, then back. A woman across the street pressed her hands to her mouth, but did not move. Somewhere, a child cried, and the sound drifted over like wind through dry leaves. I saw only the yellow shoe. It was too small to hold the weight of the moment, and yet it did. Its color pierced me like a blade, a vivid point in a gray world. My mind fixed on it because to look at anything else would have been to look at the truth. The shoe lay on its side, its laces splayed outward like pale worms. It was the shoe I had tied myself that morning, double knots so it wouldn't slip off. I moved forward finally, one step, then another. My knees buckled and hit the asphalt hard. I didn't feel the pain. My hands touched the ground, palms scraping against the grit, and I crawled the last few feet. Jenna's small body was warm when I reached for her. Her chest rose and fell faintly, a flutter like a frightened bird. Her eyes were closed, lashes resting against her cheeks. I touched her hair, then her shoulder, then pulled my hands back as if I had burned myself. Sirens began to wail in the distance. They were far at first, then nearer, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The driver knelt a few feet away, his hands gripping his head, his shoulders shaking. He kept looking at me, then at Jenna, then back at me, but I couldn't make out his words. My ears had filled with a ringing like an alarm clock that would not shut off. I pressed my hands flat against the pavement to steady myself. It was warm from the sun, but rough under my skin. Small pebbles bit into my palms. I stared at the yellow shoe again, that impossible, ordinary object now glowing in my vision like a flare. I thought of the times I had taken her to the park before, of how she had once tripped over her own feet chasing a butterfly, of how she would lean into me on the way home when she grew tired. All of that folded into this single image, a shoe at the curb and her body lying in the street. The sirens grew louder. People gathered on the sidewalk. Someone said they had called 911. Someone else asked if I was the mother. Their voices were faint, distant, like radio static from another room. I stayed crouched beside Jenna, not touching her now, afraid to make it worse, afraid to move at all. When the ambulance pulled up, its lights spinning red and white across the houses, two paramedics jumped out. One went to Jenna, kneeling, speaking in a calm, steady voice I couldn't understand. The other gently moved me back toward the curb. My legs obeyed but felt boneless. I sat on the edge of the sidewalk where her shoe had fallen. The paramedic picked it up and placed it beside me. I held it without meaning to, fingers curling around the small fabric form, the laces dangling between my knees. Time splintered then. The paramedics lifted Jenna onto a stretcher, strapped her in, inserted something into her arm. The driver of the car sat on the curb with his head between his knees. A police officer took my name and asked questions I couldn't process. The ambulance doors closed, and the siren rose again, fading as the vehicle sped away. I sat there long after it had gone. The shoe was still in my hand. Its yellow seemed brighter in the fading afternoon light, a color too bold for such a fragile world. My palm left a damp imprint on the fabric, but I didn't let go. I stared at it until my vision blurred, until it became only shape and shade, until it was no longer a shoe, but a symbol of everything I had lost in the space of a single second. Somewhere behind me, the playground noise resumed. Children running, swings creaking, mothers calling. Life resumed its rhythm, but mine had stopped. The tap of tiny feet had vanished. All that remained was the yellow shoe at the curb, small and silent, heavier than any weight I had ever held. The room felt hollow the moment I stepped back inside it. The door clicked shut behind me with an unnatural softness, like even the house understood that silence was now the new language I spoke. The air was still scented faintly with baby powder and lavender fabric spray, remnants of a routine that no longer belonged to anyone. The blinds were half drawn, and the late afternoon light came in sideways, laying long bars of gold across the carpet. There were no voices, no tiny feet slapping the floor, no laughter echoing from room to room, just the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint creak of the floor under my weight. I set my bag down gently on the table, but the sound still felt too loud. The fabric brushed against the wood like a whisper I couldn't bear to hear. My coat hung limp in my arms. I didn't put it on the hook, just dropped it over the back of the kitchen chair and left it there, crumpled like a collapsed body. My shoes came off next. I slid them off slowly, without thinking, and left them at the door in their usual place, though I no longer had anywhere to go. I walked through the house as if it weren't mine, as if I were trespassing in a life that had ended. The walls were still covered in photographs of other children I'd cared for, birthdays with frosted cupcakes, beach days with sunburnt cheeks, Christmas mornings in footed pajamas. Their smiles stared back at me like ghosts, each one unaware of the future I now carried like a stone in my chest. I passed the hallway closet where I kept the rain boots in every size, the extra wipes, the unopened bottles of baby shampoo. I didn't open it. I couldn't. Then I reached the playroom. I had always called it that, though in truth it was just the second bedroom with a worn rug and shelves stacked with plastic bins. But it was where the children always ran first. Jenna, too. She had claimed a spot near the window where the sunlight pooled like honey in the mornings, curling up with her books or stacking wooden blocks with serious, wordless concentration. Now it was still. I stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. The room no longer breathed. The bins were untouched, the stuffed animals frozen in the exact positions they had last been left. One lay face down near the bookshelf, a tiny plush fox with a torn ear. Jenna's favorite monkey had been missing that day, and I remembered telling her we'd find it after lunch. I spotted it now, slumped in the corner behind the toy box, its stitched smile crooked, one arm twisted under its soft belly. I sat on the floor without meaning to, my legs folded beneath me like paper, and my back curved as I leaned forward, pulling the monkey gently into my lap. The fabric was worn from years of small hands, the fur matted in patches. It smelled faintly of sugar and thyme. I cradled it as if it were breathing, as if it might warm in my hands and come to life again. But the room stayed cold. There were no drawings on the wall. I had taken them down the night before. Jenna's yellow suns, her smiling stick figures, her lopsided rainbows. I had unpinned them one by one, folding each sheet carefully, even as my eyes blurred with tears. They sat now in a stack on my desk, bound with a rubber band, hidden beneath an old calendar. I hadn't changed since the accident. I hadn't touched her sippy cup. It still stood on the table, half full with watered-down apple juice, a ring of condensation beneath it that had dried into a faint mark on the wood. I couldn't bring myself to wipe it away. It felt like erasing her. The silence pressed against me, not oppressive, but intimate. It knew me now. It crawled into my hair, slid along my skin, settled between my ribs like dust. I let it come. I welcomed it. I couldn't speak to anyone, not the Millers, not my neighbors, not even the court-appointed lawyer whose voicemails I hadn't returned. The world had taken a step back from me, and I had done the same. I spent the following days moving without meaning. I woke with the sun out of habit, but didn't make coffee. I didn't eat. My body continued its routines, but the soul that had once animated them had receded, tucked itself into a dark corner I didn't know how to reach. I folded laundry that hadn't been worn. I cleaned toys no one would touch. I sat in the rocker by the window and watched for birds that never came. I thought of the Millers constantly, not with anger, never with anger, but with a guilt so vast it had no bottom. I imagined their home, the stillness in their daughter's room, the unfinished art projects, the toys they might never pick up again. I imagined Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with a mug she didn't drink from, James standing in the hallway, unsure whether to go in or turn back. I imagined a house filled with breath, but no voice. I did not call them. I could not. What words could I offer that would not dissolve under their weight? What sentence could carry the truth without it collapsing into noise? So I sat in the playroom each evening, the light growing dim, the shadows lengthening across the rug. I did not light the lamp. I let the dark come in slowly, like water rising around my ankles. I held the monkey. I stared at the blank wall where drawings had once lived. And I listened. I listened for footsteps that would never come again, for laughter that had turned to memory, for the tap of tiny feet that once filled this house with purpose. But the room stayed silent, and every day it seemed to understand me more. The courthouse rose from the center of town like a relic, its brick walls weathered by decades of storms and verdicts, its windows reflecting the gray New England sky. On the morning of the hearing, I stood at the base of the steps, My hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles had turned white. The air smelled of wet paper and exhaust from buses pulling away from the nearby station. I could hear the hum of traffic, the creak of the courthouse flagpole rope, and the scattered voices of strangers already gathering to watch. The steps themselves felt longer than they were. Each one pulled at me as though weighted, and I climbed them slowly, my shoes catching on cracks in the stone. People lined the walkway, holding phones like lanterns, some with expressions of curiosity, others with faces already carved into judgment. They did not speak to me directly, but their silence was thicker than words. It clung to my coat, slid into my hair, followed me like a shadow. Inside, the building smelled of polish and old paper. The ceiling was high enough to make every sound echo. A security guard waved me through the metal detector without looking at me, his eyes already sliding to the next person. My court-appointed lawyer stood near the hallway with a stack of papers, his tie slightly askew. He gave me a nod, but no smile. We both knew there was nothing left to say. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, but it held the weight of something vast. The walls were painted a neutral beige, the kind of color that erases itself, but the benches were dark wood, polished smooth by years of bodies shifting under the same pressure. I sat at the defense table, the wood cool beneath my fingertips, and stared at the faint scratches in its surface. Someone before me had carved initials there, a tiny rebellion against the system swallowing them whole. Across the room sat the Millers. Sarah's face was pale, her hair pulled back tightly as if to keep herself from unraveling. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers rigid, nails pressed into skin. James sat beside her, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched near his temple. They did not look at me. They stared ahead toward the judge's bench, but the space between us pulsed with something electric, a current of grief and fury. Behind them, the benches were filled with strangers, neighbors, journalists, people who had seen my name scroll across their phones and wanted a story to tell at dinner. Their coats dripped from the rain outside. Some leaned forward with open curiosity. Others crossed their arms tightly, their faces masks of moral certainty. I could feel their eyes on my back as I sat, a heat crawling under my collar. They did not know me, but they had already decided what I was. The prosecutor began to speak. His voice was measured, clear, the cadence of someone who had built careers on shaping tragedy into narrative. He spoke of my duty of care, of reckless disregard, of the irreversible harm caused by negligence. Each phrase landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words themselves were enough to paint me as careless, monstrous, a cautionary tale in sensible shoes. I kept my eyes down, tracing the grain of the table with my fingertip. The lawyer beside me whispered something about maintaining composure, but his words drifted away before they reached meaning. I could hear only the low murmur of the crowd behind me, the shuffle of feet, the faint tap of someone's pen against paper as they took notes for tomorrow's article. When my lawyer rose to speak, his voice sounded thin against the prosecutor's. He spoke of my years of service, of spotless records, of glowing recommendations from families whose children I had raised as if they were my own. He used words like tragic accident and momentary lapse, but they felt weightless in the air, dissolving before they could reach the benches. I sensed the crowd leaning in, but not softening. Their eyes were already fixed on the picture the prosecutor had painted. The judge asked questions in a monotone, her expression unreadable. Each answer I gave felt like dropping pebbles into a well too deep to hear the splash. I described the day, my routine, the moment I reached for my phone. I spoke slowly, my voice steady but hollow, like a recording of myself played back from far away. No one interrupted, no one comforted. Even the air seemed to hold itself back, waiting for the verdict it already knew. At one point, I glanced toward the benches and caught the eye of a woman I didn't recognize. She held a small notebook, her pen hovering above the page. Her face was neither cruel nor kind, just blank, a mirror reflecting nothing. In that instant, I understood how I must appear to them, not a person, but a story unfolding in neat paragraphs, a character to be shaped by headlines and hashtags. When the photographs of the scene were shown, I could not look. I fixed my gaze on the tabletop as the images passed from hand to hand. The playground, the street, the yellow shoe. I felt the crowd behind me shift, a collective inhale, a whisper of paper sliding back into its envelope. My lawyer placed his hand briefly on my arm, but it did not anchor me. I was already adrift, floating somewhere between shame and disbelief. Outside, the rain continued. I could see it through the high windows, streaking the glass like veins. Drops clung to the edges before falling, leaving clear trails. The sound of it, faint and irregular, reached into the courtroom like a memory of another world. It reminded me of mornings with Jenna at the park, when she would stretch out her hand to catch raindrops, her laughter bright against the gray sky. But here there was no laughter, only the steady voice of the prosecutor, the muted defense of my lawyer, the stillness of the judge, and the eyes of the crowd. They were the real walls of this room, higher than any ceiling. Their collective judgment pressed down on me harder than the law itself. It wasn't just the state that had accused me, it was them. It was everyone who had decided that a single second was enough to erase a lifetime of care. As the hearing dragged on, I felt myself splitting in two. One part of me sat at the table, hands folded, back straight, listening to the words. The other drifted to the park, to the tap of tiny feet, to the color yellow bright against asphalt. That part of me wanted to stand and shout, to tell them all that I loved her, that I would have thrown myself in front of the car if I could. But the courtroom had no space for that kind of truth. It had only room for evidence, for testimony, for guilt measured out in legal terms. When we finally adjourned for the day, I rose on unsteady legs. The benches emptied slowly, coats and umbrellas moving like a tide toward the doors. Some glanced at me as they passed, their expressions unreadable. Others avoided my gaze entirely, as if looking at me might stain them. The Millers left without speaking, their footsteps echoing down the hall. I stood for a long time in the empty room, staring at the chair where I had sat. The wood of the bench smelled faintly of varnish and damp wool. The silence now was different from the silence outside. It was thick, sealed, like the air before a storm. I ran my hand across the table once, feeling the shallow grooves, the coolness of its surface. The crowd was gone, but its presence lingered. It had seeped into the walls, into my skin, into the story that would follow me long after the verdict. I could feel it even as I stepped out into the rain, the drops hitting my face like pinpricks. It wasn't the law alone that had condemned me. It was the eyes of the town, the whispers of strangers, the weight of their certainty pressing down on my shoulders. And as I walked down the courthouse steps, the wet stones slick beneath my shoes, I realized that I had stopped listening to the words spoken inside. It was the silence of the crowd that had already told me everything. In the months that followed the hearing, I found myself shrinking from the world in ways I didn't know were possible. My body moved through the same spaces: my kitchen, my hallway, the narrow porch that sagged on one side from years of weather and weight. But I no longer felt present in any of them. It was as if someone had erased the outlines of my life and left me only with shadows. The town became a place of corners. I learned to avoid the grocery store during peak hours. I memorized which streets felt safest to walk without seeing someone I once knew. The library became my sanctuary, the far corner by the large windows, where I could sit with a blank notebook in my lap, pretending to read while my fingers curled around the pen and stayed still. That was where the letters began. The first one came unexpectedly, written on the back of a receipt I found folded in the bottom of my purse. I didn't plan it. The words simply appeared, pouring out like water from a cracked pipe. I wrote it to Sarah, not to her public face in court, not to the hollow woman who sat across from me in silence, but to the mother I had known before, the one who had once asked me, in a quiet moment between meetings, if I thought Jenna would ever stop being afraid of the vacuum cleaner, the one who had laughed when I told her about the time Jenna tried to bathe her toy giraffe in the toilet. I wrote slowly, the pen scratching across the paper, the ink blurring where my hand trembled. I wrote about that day, not the moment it all went wrong, but the morning before, the way Jenna had clung to my leg while I buttered toast, the way she had whispered that the sun looked sleepy. I wrote about the yellow socks, the book she made me read twice, the way her head felt heavy against my chest when she dozed off under the maple tree. I folded the receipt in half and tucked it into the back of my notebook. I never intended to send it, but the act of writing had opened something in me, a place where words had gone to hide. After that, the letters came more frequently. Some I wrote to James, though I never knew quite what to say to him. His grief seemed made of metal, sharp-edged, silent, too dense to move. I wrote to Jenna, too, letters full of things I wish I'd said out loud. That her laugh was the purest sound I'd ever known. That when she slept, she held her monkey so tight it looked like she was trying to keep her dreams from floating away. That I still heard the tap of her feet in my hallway some nights, even when the house was empty. I wrote to people I hadn't seen in years, families I'd once worked for, neighbors who used to wave when I watered my plants. I wrote to the judge, though I never dared mail it. I even wrote one to the young man who had been driving the car, though I knew nothing about him except the look on his face that day, raw and pale and breaking. The letters piled up slowly. I bought a box to keep them in. It was wooden with a simple clasp, something I found in a thrift store for $3. I lined it with an old silk scarf and began placing the letters inside one by one, folding each carefully, as if creases could somehow protect the contents. I never addressed the envelopes. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where they were meant to go. Some letters were short, just a sentence or two. Some were pages long, written late at night by the light of a single lamp, when the world felt thin and the silence pressed against my chest like a weight. I cried while writing some of them. Others came out dry, almost clinical, like I was documenting a history that had happened to someone else. But in every one, I tried to tell the truth, not the kind that gets cross-examined or filed away in court records, but the truth that lives in small moments, in softness, in regret too deep for headlines. I imagined Sarah opening one of the letters, sitting at her kitchen table in the morning light, her hands hesitant as she unfolded the page. I imagined her reading the words slowly, pausing to breathe, Maybe she would cry. Maybe she would throw it away. Maybe she would read it twice. But I never gave her that chance. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't write those letters for them. I wrote them because I couldn't carry the silence any longer. Because my mind was a house filled with closed doors, and writing was the only way I could open them without screaming. I wrote to explain the unexplainable. I wrote to reach for forgiveness even if I never received it. I wrote to remember that I had loved that child, that it wasn't a job, that it was real. Some nights I would take the box out and run my fingers along its lid. I'd think about burning the letters, setting them alight in the fireplace like a ritual, letting the smoke carry the weight of my words into the night. But I never did. The idea of destroying them felt like erasing her, as if my grief only mattered if it lived on paper. So the box stayed in the closet, beneath a blanket I hadn't unfolded since the fall. I never told anyone about it, not the counselor the court assigned me, not the few people who still left voicemails on my phone. It was mine. A quiet confession in a wooden box, filled with the words, I was too afraid, too ashamed, too broken to speak aloud. I knew they would never read them, but I wrote everyone as if they might, and that was enough to keep breathing, just barely, but enough. I lived in fragments after it all ended. The days blurred into each other like watercolor bleeding on paper, edges melting until I couldn't tell one from another. Morning arrived whether I wanted it to or not, and with it came the ritual of standing at the kitchen window, staring at the street beyond the glass. I no longer saw neighbors, cars, or seasons changing. All I saw was the frame of a single moment playing and replaying, the loop of my own undoing. It was always the same. The park, the blanket, the soft hum of cicadas in the grass, Jenna's curls glowing like amber in the sunlight, my hand reaching into the bag for my phone, the weight of it in my palm, the way my thumb brushed across the screen. And then nothing but silence. That was where the film of my life snapped, where the reel burned. A second that stretched endlessly, like a wire pulled so tight it could never go slack again. I tried to build new routines. I took long walks at dawn before the town awoke, pacing along empty sidewalks with my coat pulled tight, breathing in the cold air until my chest ached. I folded laundry even when there was nothing to wash, stacked it neatly in drawers no one would open. I scrubbed the same section of countertop for hours, hoping the friction might erase something in me. But no matter what I did, the second followed. It nested inside my ribs, waited behind every blink. At night, I lay awake in the small bedroom I had rented after moving away from the Millers' neighborhood. The room smelled of dust and old paint. The window faced a brick wall that caught no light, and yet I could still see that second flickering across it like a shadow play. Sometimes I pressed my hands against my temples as if I could push it out. Sometimes I whispered apologies to no one, my breath warm against the cold air. I had been told by the counselor assigned after the trial that time would soften it. She said memory was like a river, carving new paths, finding new currents. But mine was not a river. It was a frozen pond with a single crack running through it. I kept falling through the same spot, plunging into the same dark water. I saw Jenna everywhere, not as she had been in the hospital, but as she had been on that blanket. Tiny fingers brushing clover across my palm, yellow socks slipping down her ankles. I heard her voice in the hiss of buses braking, in the squeal of bicycle tires, in the creak of playground swings as I passed a schoolyard. I avoided parks entirely, crossing the street to escape the sight of slides and climbing frames. But even the sound of a child's laugh in the supermarket could undo me, snapping me back to that second, the one where she vanished from view. I wrote more letters during this time, though fewer than before. The words came slower, like syrup thickening in the cold. They were no longer addressed to anyone. They were addressed to that second. I begged it to release me. I cursed it. I described it over and over until the description dissolved into scribbles. Then I folded the pages and slipped them into the wooden box with the others, each one another fragment of my confession. Even sleep wasn't safe. Dreams pulled me into loops of endless searching, me running across a field of grass that stretched forever, calling her name, my throat raw, my feet sinking into mud. Sometimes I reached her in the dream, touched her shoulder, turned her face toward me, only to find it blurred like a photograph left in the rain. I woke gasping, my hands clutching the sheets as if they were her small fingers. I stopped answering the phone entirely. The messages from the court had stopped months ago, but occasionally someone from the past would call. An old client, a neighbor, a journalist chasing a follow-up. Their voices filled the voicemail box with polite hesitation. I deleted them without listening. My world had become a single soundless frame, and anything outside it felt like static. The second was not just a memory, it was a geography. My body lived in it. My lungs breathed its air. My heart beat to its rhythm. It had become a room with no doors, lined with mirrors reflecting only my own face. I walked its perimeter each day, tracing the same steps, feeling the same ground beneath me. Sometimes I sat on the floor of my kitchen with the lights off, holding one of Jenna's yellow shoes. I had kept it hidden in the bottom drawer, wrapped in a soft cloth. The fabric had faded slightly, but its color still pierced me. I held it in my lap, fingers tracing the outline, the stitching, the worn sole. It was the only object that felt real anymore. When I touched it, the world shrank to the size of my palms, and for a moment the noise inside my head quieted. I had tried to give it away once. I placed it in a donation box outside the church, thinking perhaps releasing it would release me. But an hour later I returned, digging through the bag of unwanted clothes until I found it again, clutching it to my chest like a lifeline. I walked home with it hidden under my coat, my face burning, ashamed of how much I needed it. People spoke of closure as if it were a door you could simply pull shut. But I had learned that some doors don't close. Some seconds stretch on forever, holding you in place even as the world moves around you. They become your address, your gravity, your silent companion. On quiet mornings, when the sun slipped in low through the blinds, I would sit at my kitchen table and try to imagine a day when I wouldn't feel the second pressing against my skin. A day when my hands wouldn't shake at the sound of children's voices. A day when I could pass a park without crossing the street. But imagining it felt like betrayal, as if leaving that second behind meant leaving her behind too. So I stayed. I stayed in the second. It was the only thing that still connected me to her. And in the hush of that endless moment, I built my life piece by piece, a fragile structure around an unhealed wound, knowing it might never release me, but still, somehow, needing to hold it close.